You're listening to the 3 Feet Radio Show with Ben Carbonaro and Luke Herbert. From our studios come special guests and netball commentary, exclusively on YouTube.
Good afternoon, listeners, and welcome again to the 3 Feet Radio Show. This is our final show for 2014, and Luke and I just wanted to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I'll give you to Luke. I'm sure Luke's got a few things to say as well, just wrapping up the year.
Oh, yes, I do. And, by the time the listener catches this program, I would have started my chocolate Christmas calendar, which would be nice. And perhaps your coffee machine will be back under warranty after the repairs are done. But, Ben, just as a sort of overview, give us what your thoughts were on this year's ANZ Championship.
I thought the ANZ Championship season this year, Luke, was probably the most open season in history we've seen. People have been saying, open in history across every season, the ANZ Championship. But this one in particular, so much so that we were almost towards the finals in the last couple of weeks, and there were any number of teams that could have made it. And also, I think the fact that there were so many player movements reflected that loyalty in netball in Australia and New Zealand doesn't really exist anymore. It's now a business. And I must also say too, maybe a bit of bias because I am from Melbourne. Congratulations to Simone McInnes and the Melbourne Vixens on winning the ANZ Championship title.
Yeah, there's been a trend over the last, say, 2, maybe even 3 seasons that instead of having a clear-cut best team, you've had a very even competition, which certainly, I think it's very good for the viewer and viewers' interest and the people that, just attend games, the home fans that take out memberships and pay for tickets, they only go to 1 or 2 games a season. And it is certainly a player's market now. You've only got to look how the Magic recruited in the last off-season and, everyone thought they weren't going to go far, but they made the top 4. So, is there anything else that stands out for you about the ANZ Championship season?
Yeah, I think certainly what would stand out for me, Luke, is I think our media colleagues are finally cottoning on to what a great competition we've got here and what a great product we've got here. I mean, there's still certainly work to be done in Australia, not necessarily in New Zealand, but more and more coverage, I reckon, in the papers I've been seeing. I've seen an increase in the amount of people that are in the same areas that I sit at games. It's been great.
Yeah, and I think that is a positive because the more the ANZ Championship expands into the Australian sporting market, the better off the competition will be. So, while we will do a preview of next season's ANZ Championship in the new year, just quickly, Ben, do you expect that trend to continue with media coverage increasing in Australia?
Yeah, I most certainly do, although we probably do need to see more than 1 game a week shown on free-to-air television. People have complained about that for quite a few years now here anyway, because you see every game is live on Fox, but you get 1 game a week on SBS. And I think if they have more than 1 game, it would certainly make it a lot more accessible because netball traditionally, it's the same in New Zealand too, and pretty much anywhere in the world where it's played, has a working class background. And we're talking about families here who, they might have 2, 3, 4 kids, and they can't necessarily afford to have Foxtel. I mean, I'm very lucky here at home that we do have Foxtel. It's a privilege, not a right. But if they make it a bit more accessible, it might make people become more interested because not every family can afford tickets to an ANZ game either.
And just before we leave this topic of the ANZ Championship, I just want to point out one thing to the Kiwi listener who will be familiar with or is used to, pay TV, Sky Sport having a monopoly on live sports coverage. The commercial networks in Australia have a lot more money to play with in terms of them being able to fund TV deals with sports. You can see this in how the NRL is, I believe it's on Channel 9 in Australia, and the AFL has a lot of live coverage. Sorry, Channel 7 has a lot of live coverage of the AFL. And the simple fact is those networks have the money to write out the checks to those respective sports to secure the TV coverage. But I need to move along. So Ben, moving along chronologically in how the season went, what's next up for us to tackle?
Next up, we're going to have a look at the Commonwealth Games, which saw Australia win. But also, one of the big talking points that come out of Glasgow was England's severe underperformance.
Yes, and just before I get to England's underperformance, I just want to say unequivocally the Australian Diamonds were the best team at the Commonwealth Games, and they deserve to win. Let's make no bones about that. And again, congratulations to them. But coming back to England before I touch on how New Zealand went, yeah, I think England were the most disappointing side at the Commonwealth Games, or at least at the netball event. And that's saying a lot when you consider how New Zealand ultimately fared. I think England could have beaten both New Zealand and Australia. I think they were victims of some very strange coaching decisions. You can see that in how Jade Clark, one of the world's best mid-quarters, was consistently on the bench. And for a team like England that doesn't have a lot of depth, that's a real head-scratcher.
It most certainly is, Luke, but it's also since subsequently been revealed via our friends at netballscoop.com. Hello to Tanya and everyone else if you are listening to the show today. That there are problems. There's a lot of administrative problems below, and there's also all sorts of things going on that are sort of trickling up, and it's not very good for the national side.
No, I have no reason to believe that you're not correct in that assessment, simply because with the sport growing in England, with you have the Super League, and you have the likes of Team Bath, which have supplied a number of English players into the ANZ Championship, like Jade Clark, for instance.
And Ebony Beckford-Chambers as well. We might add her in there too.
As the sport grows, if its admin and management base doesn't grow with it, then you are going to have problems. You are going to perhaps get conflicts of interest, but we will have to leave it there because I want to touch on how New Zealand went at the Commonwealth Games. And, well, you've got to say the selectors and the coaches really did a poor job of selecting the squad. As we have talked about on our program, that when we wrapped up the Commonwealth Games, there were too many players that had been selected on reputation and not form, or the selectors didn't even have confidence in them. So, just before we leave the Commonwealth Games, how would you contrast that with how the selectors and coaches did with the Australian Diamonds, Ben?
Obviously, Aaron Bell not being picked for the Glasgow Commonwealth Games with the Diamonds caused a bit of a stir there. But at the same time, too, I think Lisa Alexander and the selectors are to be credited. They picked a side with a lot of experience and a little bit of inexperience. But I thought generally it was a pretty good mix, and it all gelled well together to lead them to gold medal success.
But just to pin you down on this before we leave the Commonwealth Games,
yep.
You think it's fair to say that the Australian Diamond side was selected more on form than reputation, though?
Yeah, certainly, absolutely, and I think that's probably a good thing. There were quite a few names missing. I mentioned Aaron Bell, and there are a few others as well that didn't make the side either. That otherwise would have previously made the team. Say when Norma Plummer was the coach. But I think it's good to see that form it was picked on form, because if you pick purely on reputation, you may not be performing at your best, and therefore in a tournament like the Commonwealth Games, you've got to perform your best consistently over a short period of time. Is a championship where you have one game a week. It's a very condensed period. You're playing 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 games over a 10-day period, Lou.
Yes, and just before we leave the Commonwealth Games, also, I need to mention that the New Zealand side was dogged by injuries.
They were. Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't omit that because it was, not the deciding factor on how the New Zealand side went, but it was a factor in how they fared at the Commonwealth Games. So, shifting along, Ben, that brings us to the Constellation Cup.
Yeah, it does, and we saw the Australian Diamonds reclaim that, although it was soured a little bit, unfortunately, by seeing Casey Corporal go down in the Sydney Test. I was there at the game, and when that happened, I think all the crowd, regardless of whether you're an Australian or a Kiwi, you had your hand on your heart and your tongue in your mouth, so to speak.
That was an awful injury. I went to the game in Invercargill, and I, like a lot of people, including the ones on the Netball Scoop forum, hello if you're listening, I faulted the Silver Fern selectors for basically going with the same side that we had at the Commonwealth Games, minus any injured players like Maria Tutoya, simply because where the Silver Ferns or New Zealand were at the time, we weren't going to win the Constellation Cup, so why not give some younger and up-and-coming players a crack and give them some experience and try and build some depth in the team in the lead up to next year's World Cup.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Luke. And I think with the Diamonds, we did see that happen too a little bit. We saw Tegan Caldwell certainly come on and have an impact, like she did at the Glasgow Commonwealth Games, which was her debut international tournament at senior level. And later on in the international season too, which we will touch on, we saw the likes of a Claire McMiniman come in. Someone who has been on the cusp of national selection for quite a few years now. And when given the opportunity, I thought she actually fitted in pretty well.
Ultimately, I don't think the Silver Ferns really got anything out of the Constellation Cup. Perhaps individual players did improve parts of their game. Looking at how, the margins they lost the games by, again, what harm would have been done if some up and coming players had been given a crack? Because the Silver Ferns' lack of depth was exposed at the Commonwealth Games with the horrific injury toll. Just about all four shooters were injured to some degree at some point during that tournament. So just before we have to shift gears and the cake is served to us in the studio, do you have anything that you'd like to add about Australia winning the Consolation Cup?
Yeah, I would. Although she didn't necessarily always get consistent court time, I think congratulations to Caitlin Thwaites to have finally sort of played some games for Australia. Caitlin's another one who's been on the cusp for a little while now, and it was great to see her finally get the opportunity when she was given it, and pretty much take it with both hands. Although she probably was a little bit down sometimes against the New Zealand defence, I thought she did stand up when she could.
Yeah, and it's good to see a player come through the ranks. And, not every player is going to crack the national side at the age of 21. So, good on her, I reckon, Ben.
Yeah, I agree too. And as much as there's been negative press about her going over and deciding to play in New Zealand at the Pulse, I think her going over to the Pulse certainly was very good for her netball. And then moving to the Swifts and forming a pretty good combination with Susan Prattley, was good for her too. She just had to get away from Melbourne.
Yeah, the change in scene when she went to the Pulse did her wonders, and it opened up the opportunity for her at the Swifts eventually, which came about when the Pulse recruited Irene van Dijk. But I think we'll take a closer look at the Pulse again during our preview show of the ANZ Championship next year.
Certainly looking forward to that. It's going to be a big 2015 of the ANZ Championship, Luke.
Oh, yeah, it will. And in our previous program, we looked at the conference system that they're bringing into the ANZ Championship next season. So if you haven't got that program, tune in.
Most certainly. And we saw the Australia versus England series. We saw Australia 2-0 win that series. I was at the Bendigo test, and the Bendigo Stadium is certainly more of what you would call a boutique stadium. It's quite small. It also hosts basketball in the WNBL, which is our national basketball competition for women. And it's great to see Netball Australia having more games in regional areas. They also played in Canberra. You could call Canberra a regional area, although it is our capital city. It certainly is a lot smaller than, say, a Melbourne, a Sydney, or a Brisbane. And everyone in Bendigo certainly came out and enjoyed the game, and it was great.
And just for the benefit of the listener outside of Australia, can you just clarify a little bit? Bendigo is basically a sort of rural venue.
Yeah, it is. It's a regional city. It's probably about an hour and a half, up to 2 hours from Melbourne.
Yeah, and I think it's great that the Australian Diamonds went to those areas that they don't traditionally visit, and it gives fans, particularly the kids that don't really have a lot of choice over where they live, a chance to go see their netball sporting idols out on court.
I agree with that, Luke. And in the Bendigo test, what we did see was we saw Caitlin Bassett and Rebecca Bully, both products of Bendigo originally, come out on court and play on court together. And I tell you, when that happened, the crowd went absolutely nuts. And Lisa Alexander actually got asked in the post-match press conference, the Diamonds coach, was it because you're playing in Bendigo? And she said, absolutely not. It was because both girls had earned their opportunity.
Still would have been special for the home crowd, though. And hey, stuff like that is just priceless, and stuff you don't forget if you're coming on at your home venue and the crowd's cheering you on. I mean, how does it get any better than that?
And just to touch also on another series, Luke, the English also travelled across the ditch there to New Zealand, and they played against the Silver Ferns, and the Silver Ferns won on goal difference.
Yeah, I believe they did. And look, having a 2-game series was just plain dumb. Why they couldn't schedule a third game so we had a decider, I honestly don't know. I don't really see how it couldn't have been fitted into the schedule, and what difference would have one extra game made. And really, again, the selectors and the coaches for the Silver Ferns really did their side in. They shot themselves in the foot by, again, not blooding too many up-and-coming players. And, when you're in the position that the Silver Ferns are in, what do you have to lose by blooding up-and-coming players? Okay, it's a year or two before you might have done it regularly in the 4-year World Cup Commonwealth Games cycle. But it just so happens that due to the lack of player and coaching development pathways in New Zealand that we have discussed on this program previously, that the process has to begin a couple of years sooner. And burying your head in the sand deeper and deeper will not help the national side at all.
And I think credit where it's due also to Netball New Zealand for doing what Netball Australia have done, taking it out to regional centres or to smaller venues. And those two tests were played at the Energy Events Centre in Rotorua, where England won 42-38. And then in the second game, that was played at Palmerston North at Arena Manawatu. And the Silver Ferns coming out 52-38 winners over England in that game.
Yeah, and just for the sake of the Australian listener, New Zealand being a smaller country, it is easier to spread games around the more rural or less urban centres just because of the distances involved. So, but, I'm very pleased when the Silver Ferns do play outside of the main centres. Obviously, I don't live near one of the main centres anymore, so I'm a bit biased. But by the same token, the people that live in those areas should be getting games, and they do. So, I think that's one thing that Netball New Zealand's done very well is how the Silver Ferns, they play around the country. And, if you live in a certain part of the country, you may not get a game every year, because basically that's really only Auckland due to the population. But usually within 3 or say maybe 4 years, you will see or get an opportunity to see the Silver Ferns play either in in the city you live in or within reach. And, applause to Netball New Zealand for that.
At the same time, too, though, unfortunately, there was a bit of a scheduling clash in that fourth test between the Silver Ferns and the Diamonds, which the Diamonds did win 51-47. That was my first ever international netball game in New Zealand. It was played at the Trust Stadium, which I must say it's a bit of a bugger to get out to, but lucky I was able to get a lift out there. Thank you to Kimberly Downs from TV New Zealand and her cameraman who took me out there, and I got a lift back with them as well. It had to be played out there rather than at Vector because unfortunately at Vector at the time there was a Justin Timberlake concert. But unfortunately that's how logistics work sometimes, Luke. And being at Trust Stadium though, it reminded me of the good old days going to smaller venues to watch international tests. Going to, say, the Netball Hockey Centre here in Melbourne when Australia have played Jamaica or played England, for example.
And just for the sake of the listener, you're referring to when you came over for the Constellation Cup earlier on in the season.
Yeah, that's right. I was over there for the fourth test, and thank you to Kerry Manders and the crew at Netball New Zealand for looking after me. I was taken out to lunch and I was driven around to a few places when I wasn't expecting it, so thank you once again to Kerry and Netball New Zealand.
Yeah, Kerry is a gem and has been very supportive of the show. We don't usually acknowledge the media managers and people that support the show just because there's a lot of them, so it does tend to be unfair to single out one individual, but, once in a blue moon, we do have to, shout out to the show's supporters.
We do, Luke, because without them, we wouldn't get the talent we need to interview on our show. And the next thing on the menu here is the Fast Five. I think probably the big highlight of the Fast Five was seeing Irene van Dijk being farewelled after a glittering international career.
Yeah, and I think, well, I can't speak for the people that were in the crowd or other people. It's probably, my suspicion would be that is primarily what people will remember the 2014 Fast Five event for, Irene van Dijk being farewelled. Also worthwhile noting that at the time of recording, there's no scheduled event for next year. The official line from Netball New Zealand is that it clashes with the World Cup in terms of scheduling, but I think it's more to do with the fact that if the event really is only just making money in New Zealand with the benefit of Sky and the relationship Netball New Zealand has with pay TV, and you look at how the host country pays for the visiting teams to fly in to, well, in the case it's been New Zealand, I don't really see how the event's going to be held outside of New Zealand just because of the costs involved. An event has to make money.
Events do have to make money, although there have been calls to have it here in Australia. But at the same time, too, we've already got the Netball World Cup coming up here in Sydney in August next year, and they've also got the upcoming ANZ Championship pre-season tournament, the Summer Challenge, to be held from February 6 to 8, which was actually officially announced today.
But just coming back to Fast Five, I don't really have any problem with the event itself. It's a lot of fun if you're in the audience as a spectator, but I think the focus should have been on developing player and coach development pathways in New Zealand instead of, developing the Fast Five as a product, because, the way New Zealand fared at the Commonwealth Games speaks for itself. And just before we leave the Fast Five, which just about brings us to the end of the program. I think the other issue too with Fast Five is, how do you develop the concept? You know, some people might say it should go the way of rugby sevens and have an international circuit. You know, obviously that would have to be, commercially viable, but, where can the likes of Netball Australia take the Fast Five events so it can make money, it can be profitable, and it can be held again? Do you have any thoughts on that, Ben?
I do have thoughts on it. I think the Fast Five would be a good way to popularise netball in places, big markets like America and also China too. But at the same time too, what you'd need celebrity star power, pulling power of big names to be playing. But the problem is, where do you fit it in? If it's a circuit going around like rugby sevens, where do you fit it in? Are we going to have players that are specialists? That's all they do. They don't play ANZ. They only do that. It just brings up so many sort of problems or ideas on how it could work or how it could not work.
Yeah, there's the potential there. It's just if it can be unlocked, and that's the big question. I do think we are going to see Fast Five played again in the future. I think there may be a gap of, I don't know, it could even be 3 years, say, before we see it played again. But I don't think we've seen the last of Fast Five. It's just, I think Netball New Zealand may have to focus on other areas for a while, which they are starting to focus on, the likes of coaching development pathways in New Zealand, and I think that really needs their attention over the next 2-3 years before we think about doing anything like Fast Five again.
And congratulations also to the New Zealand Fast Ferns for their 35-31 defeat of Australia in the final. And I think it's credit where it's due to Jane Searle and Jane Woodlands-Thompson, the two coaches of the Australian Fast Five Flyers, because previously we've seen Australia not do too well in this tournament. So credit where it's due there too, I think.
Yeah, credit to the winners and credit to Australia for reaching the final. The improvement that side's shown over the last couple of events has been very noticeable.
It has been an onwards and upwards. There's certainly some talent to play with in the future in that side. There was too. Well, listeners, hope you've enjoyed our wrap of 2014 and all things netball. Luke and I would like to wish you a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thanks very much for listening.
You've been listening to the 3 Feet Radio Show with Ben Carbonaro and Luke Herbert. Tune in next time for more special guests and netball commentary exclusively on YouTube.